In Book 3, Section 10 of the Consolation of Philosophy, Lady Philosophy makes 6 important points that I'd like you to watch for as you read these pages. Her first point is that the perfect good does in fact exist. She says on page 86, we now will look at where perfect happiness can be found, but that the perfect good, the source of all good, exists is impossible to deny. And here's her argument. Anything that is imperfect because it is lacking in some way and falls short of perfection. Therefore, we can reason that if there is a class of things in which there are imperfections, there must also be, in that class, the perfect thing. Without the perfect thing, it could not even be imagined how the imperfect ones could exist. So we have here an argument from perfection, from imperfection. Because imperfect things exist, the perfect thing must exist. Now, this is an argument which may make us suspicious. There are some criticisms we can make of it, and I think we'll make those at a later point. What I want to point out right now is that this idea of a perfect being, in terms of which others are to be understood as imperfect, is really central to the entire cosmology, to the entire world picture of Roman Christianity. God is perfect, God is good. The world that God made was originally perfect and good, and since then it has fallen from it. So we understand evil as a departure from the plan, a loss of the primordial goodness, a fall, if you will, into imperfection. Provided we understand the limitations and sufferings of this world as being imperfections, we relate them then to the perfect being, which imperfection necessarily implies. Now, we may resist defining limited being as imperfect in this way. We may put this world picture up against a different cosmology, a world picture which would hold that order has emerged gradually over millions of years out of chaos. But Lady Philosophy explicitly denies that idea. Here on page 86, she writes, the universe did not begin with diminished, unfinished, and imperfect things, but began with perfections from which it lapsed into the present diminished and exhausted state. So perhaps later on we'll put these two cosmologies head to head and compare them and see which we find more persuasive. Lady Philosophy's position is going to be that this cosmology which holds that order emerged gradually out of chaos is irrational. It's less rational than believing that there is a perfect order from which the present state of things is a lapse or a fall. So I'd like to draw your attention to that and to the argument that Lady Philosophy makes on page 86. The next important point she makes is that God is the perfect good. This is on page 87. She says, if we want to know where this can be found, we must think in this way. We can demonstrate that God is good by looking at how men conceive of God, than whom nothing can be better. Her argument here then is essentially that because God is the highest possible being, the highest conceivable being, whatever good God possesses must be perfect good. We can't say that God is the highest being is only sort of good or occasionally good or good in some ways but not in others. If there's any good in God at all, it must be perfect because of the definition and understanding of God as the highest being. That definition of God, again, we may critique, we may resist, we may think of reasons for rejecting it. We'll do that later on. Right now, in terms of understanding Lady Philosophy, from this idea of God as the highest conceivable being follows that God is the perfect good. And our next important point is that this goodness is in fact part of the substance, of the essence, of the very nature of God. She says at the bottom of 87, where does God get this good from? Does he receive it from outside of himself? If he does, then whatever being gave it to him would be higher than him. And we've already defined God as being this highest possible being. So the goodness of God cannot have its source outside of God, it must be inside God. And furthermore, if it is within him, but it's not part of his essence, then it must be joined to his essence by some power. And whoever has that power to join goodness to the essence of God is again greater than or more powerful than God, and that conflicts with our initial definition of God. So we conclude then on page 88 that there's no question that the author of all things is inherently and in his substance the highest good. So not only is God the perfect good and the highest good, this highest good is actually part of the very built-in nature or being of God. This is not just a role God happens to fill, like the office of the presidency. This is what God is most fundamentally in God's being. The next point Lady Philosophy makes is that the highest human good and happiness and God are all the same thing. This is the top of page 89. God and happiness are the highest good. So when we're talking about what the highest human good is, we came to the conclusion earlier that it could be nothing in this world that could satisfy us. And the answer is that it's God. God and goodness and the highest human good are all the same thing. This then tells us, and also in the middle of page 89, that people who pursue happiness are really pursuing God, and they have been all along. This is a similar point to one that we see made by St. Augustine in his Confessions, when he says, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. When St. Augustine says, all the times I was chasing after happiness and pleasure and in seeking honor and wisdom and all sorts of worldly goods, I understand now, Augustine says, that I was ultimately seeking God, but it was futile and I was miserable and unhappy because I wasn't seeking God in the right way. Boethius making a similar point, I think, here, that the frantic pursuit people have of the different things they think will make them happy is ultimately a kind of confused pursuit of God, who is the highest good, who is ultimate happiness. Lady Philosophy also says something interesting here about divination. She says at the bottom of page 89 that we don't become God, but there is this way in which there's nothing that prevents the acquisition of divinity by participation in his divinity. This idea that we humans, in drawing closer to God, can become similar to God. We can enter by participation into the happiness of the divine life. And I think this is part of a philosophical portrait of what heavenly existence is like, what salvation is like. It's eternal happiness in the presence of God, participating in the divine life in some fashion. So we'll talk about that perhaps later on. The final point Lady Philosophy makes in this section is that when we desire a thing in this world, what we really desire is not the thing itself, but the goodness in the thing. And since goodness is identical with God, we're really wanting God through that thing that we're pursuing, whether it's horseback riding, which is her example, or health, or pleasure. Ultimately, what we're looking for and what we're really desiring, what's driving us towards it, is that we see some glimmer of goodness in it. Recognizing then that that goodness is God and that desire for that goodness in us is a desire for God, this then should be able to transform our entire attitude. The poem that ends this section then on pages 91 and 92 celebrates the liberation of prisoners. What we've just gotten here is the kind of knowledge that should set us free. She says, come out, you prisoners, loosed from your chains and shame, come out together into the light and air, freed from the bonds of desire. So what's happened? This allows us to make sense of this, the fact that God and goodness and happiness are identical, and that our desire for chasing after all the things that we have wanted in this world is ultimately about our desire for God. This is what this poem is celebrating. It ends by saying the grandeur of heaven eludes the corrupted soul. And only those who can see with their eyes and their minds can observe this light, brighter than any sun. So I think here is the breakthrough moment in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, where we're invited to share with Boethius in realizing that this is the ultimate nature of human reality. This is the nature of the cosmos. This is where we can understand ourselves and our inability to be happy with things in this world by turning towards God and correcting our idea of happiness to correspond to the truth that Lady Philosophy reveals here. So that's my quick commentary on Book 3, Section 10 of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.